Are live. This is Sound Booth Theater Live. This is the fifth part of the cold reads for Zero's Return by Sara King. Sara King has joined us as usual in the stream. Hello, Sara.
Hello, everyone.
And yes, Missy is correct. I have recovered from eyebrow implant surgery. I am now able to lift 20 extra pounds with my eyebrows that I couldn't before. Thankfully, the scarring is pretty minimal. I can now use my camera. I'm no longer ashamed of how I look. And yeah, I'm ready to get started on some more Zero's Return. So we are on chapter 9. Is this pronounced Shale?
Oh my God, we're on Shale. Oh, that's so awesome. Yes,
Looks like
it's
it.
Shale.
All right. So who is Shale? Or yeah. Let me know more about Shale so I can.
Okay, so Shale is actually a girl, even though it says he.
Okay.
Um, and basically the most try to make a female Klingon.
Okay.
Think female Klingon for Shale's voice, but
Is
a
this
human.
Shale's a human?
Yeah,
Okay, but it says he for a reason.
yes, it does.
Okay. So, for those of you who missed yesterday, we finished up chapter 6, which was Ghost and Tyson. Tyson's Ghost's or Sam or Slade's new henchman, who is from Texas, maybe? I can't remember if he said where he was from, but he's got a southern accent. He's blonde. He's kind of a tough guy. And so they got out of the prison and immediately got accosted by a Kreenit, so they went back inside. They killed the Kreenit eventually. Then the next chapter was Rat crash landing on Earth and breaking every bone in her body and getting her gun stolen, and her biosuit is trashed, so she's pretty fucked on Earth right now. She's gonna go get her
And
crippled ass after whoever stole her gun.
and now you get to meet Shale.
And now you get to meet Shale. Actually, and then the chapter before, we did just meet back up with 12A and his naked posse as they mentally destroyed lots of things. So, all right, we're back at it. Chapter 9,
Okay,
Shale.
so things, I guess this is spoilers. If anybody like is afraid of spoilers, turn off your sound for just a second. Um, so Shale is a woman that has been brainwashed into thinking she is a dreet. So, um, have her act like a dreet, have
Okay.
her like the same like sound patterns, but not the obviously not the deep rumbly voice, but like the simple sound patterns you did with Davine,
Yep.
and just you know that's what's going on.
All right. Got it. All right. We begin with chapter 9 today, everybody. Thanks again for joining. And hope you guys have a good time while you're here. So, not sure what's going on here. My Stream Deck's not working. Let's see. I guess I need to turn the Stream Deck app on, which it's usually on its own. I don't know why it had turned off in the first place. There we go. There we go. All right. Chapter 9. Shale. Shale opened his eyes, Realizing the light inside his bed had gone dark, the voices and images having stopped. He realized, hungry. Gingerly, Shale tried to lift his hands, but, as always, they were locked in place.
Why am I still here? He demanded. Give me my Mela and let me take a piss, you skulking cowards!
Dr. Philip, the only one of the weakling bipeds who could... Dr. Philip, the only one of the weakling bipeds who could speak his language, did not respond. His bed remained dark, the images withdrawn, the voices silent. Outside his bed, Shale heard nothing. Locked into place so that his powerful body wouldn't destroy their insignificant dwelling with any twitchings in his sleep, Shale's heart nonetheless began to pound. It was abnormal, being left in the darkness. Not once in all his turns with the weaklings did they forget to feed him.
How dare you leave me here? He snapped. I'll make you all dance on my tech for ignoring me, you soot-eating Fergs!
The threat evoked not a single sound from the room beyond his bed. In a growing fury, he yanked on his arms to break the restraints that held him in place. Despite his great strength, however, the metal sheaths remained solidly attached to his massive wrists. Despite his great strength, however, the metal sheaths remained solidly attached to his massive wrists.
Quivering tacky! Release me!
More time passed. Too much time. No matter how Shale called or fought his bed, his caretakers ignored him. Eventually, Shale had to piss himself. It was the shame of the hot liquid running from his bladder to pool under his coils that flipped a switch in Shale's mind. He, the greatest warrior of Welu. Had been forced to lie in his own piss like a penned tacky. Letting out a scream, he slipped into his war mind and watched the world around him shift. Everything, even the air, became a foggy blue-green stew of motion. Shale wrapped a mental wall around the sea-green motion of the bed cocoon. Shale wrapped a mental wall around the sea-green motion of the bed cocoon's husk and, with a squeeze of his consciousness, crushed it, compacting it above him with a scream of tearing metal and puny electronics. Because that wasn't terrifying enough for the inbred tacky to take a proper lesson from their superior, and because he was hungry, Shale slammed the shattered lid...
Angry, not hungry.
Hungry.
Oh.
Because that wasn't terrifying enough for the inbred tacky to take a proper lesson from their superior, and because he was angry, Shale slammed the shattered lid of his bed across the room, through the concrete wall that separated his room from others, and into the bedrock of the mountain on the other side. Through the concrete wall that separated his room from others, and into the bedrock of the mountain on the other side. Though he didn't see it with his eyes, his war mind had a complete 360-degree view, as far as he wanted to go in any direction, and he watched the foggy particles of air slip around the heavier movement of the door until it finally came to a rest embedded in the mountainside.
Show yourselves, skulkers!
Shale snarled. Surrounding the heavy density of the cuffs with his mind, he formed a barrier between his wrist and the metal, then wrenched upwards, easily tearing them free.
Come out of the shadows you're hiding in and face me!
The cowards left him in darkness. Of course they did. Any skulking fool like Dr. Philip would know that he was soon to dangle from his tech for the slight. Even then, Shale's coils were prickling into hard bumps where the hair... Even then, Shale's coils were prickling into hard bumps where the air hit his cooling piss.
Face me!
Shale screamed. This time, he wrapped his mind around his bed and hurled it through the front door, which Dr. Philip kept locked to keep lesser creatures from wandering upon Shale and wasting his air. There was a resounding crash as his bed disintegrated upon impact with the solid stone wall on the other side, but other than that, there were no challenges, no movement in the corridor whatsoever. The skulkers were hiding? The door open and the hallway outside exposed, Shale saw none of the weaklings in his war mind. When he extended his awareness outward, seeking the Ferg who would dance on his tech for leaving him there, everything felt deserted. The only life he could see in the maze of tunnels nearby was a cluster of soft-skinned weaklings like Dr. Philip, who were even then spiraling the foggy green air away from their mouths and panting whimpers of terror as they huddled together in the dark. Frowning, Shale slid through the door and up the hallway, shoving softly glowing green. Frowning, Shale slid through the door and up the hallway, shoving softly glowing green particles. Frowning, Shale slid through the door and up the hallway, shoving softly glowing green particles aside with his body, using his war mind to guide him in the total blackness. Frowning, Shale slid through the door and up the hallway, shoving softly... Frowning, Shale slid through the door and up the hallway, shoving softly glowing green particles aside with his body, using his war mind to guide him in the total blackness. He found the group of weaklings huddled by the war room, staring at the door in panic. Shale snorted and wove past them. More cowards.
Dr. Philip!
He shouted into the hall ahead of him, making the weaklings at his back cringe and whimper. Shale ignored them.
Come out and face me! You die today, skulker!
If Dr. Philip heard him, he did not respond. Of course not. Like all the quibbling, sticky Fergs who lived on this miserable planet, he was a coward at heart. Shale again regretted ever taking up the task to train them. He had sworn, on his honor, he would give these Fergs the tools they needed to have a... Just changed the direction of the mic a little bit. He had sworn, on his honor, he would give these Fergs the tools they needed to have a fighting chance in the army. Yet, he had done much less fighting than he had sleeping, and the Ferg, Dr. Philip, didn't seem to care that Shale hadn't been given a chance to do his duty and teach his underlings yet. What was worse, every time Shale brought up the fact he hadn't done any training of his assigned weaklings, Dr. Philip would tell him tomorrow, or that his underlings were out on a training exercise in tunnels much too small for Shale's massive coils. Dr. Philip. What was worse, every time Shale brought up the fact he hadn't done any training of his assigned weaklings, Dr. Philip would tell him tomorrow, or that his underlings were out on a training exercise. Fuck. What was worse, every time Shale brought up the fact he hadn't done any training of his assigned weaklings, Dr. Philip would tell him tomorrow, or that his underlings were out on a training exercise in tunnels much too small for Shale's massive coils. Then he would feed him and send him to bed, like a hatchling. Scowling, Shale glanced back the way he had come. He was hungry, he reminded himself, and his servants had always delivered his melah to his room. If he wasn't in his room when the lazy aliens decided to get off their coils and bring him food, he might miss it entirely. No, Shale decided.
I will find my own food. I'm tired of their incompetence.
He had been begged by the Black Dreet herself to teach these useless Fergs battle tactics and the basic code. He had been begged by the Black Dreet herself to teach these useless Fergs battle tactics and the basic code of a warrior, but thus far he'd spent more time in his bed than actually instructing his subordinates. For untold twists of the coil, they had intentionally delayed their training. They had fed him and kept him happy, satiated him, lied to him, procrastinated. Shale found himself tired of the planet and its tiny, soft, stupid inhabitants. It was time for him to go back to Welu. And, right there, he decided he was done trying to train Fergs who skulked in the shadows, hiding from him, avoiding their assemblies, quietly trying to fatten up their commander so he would be too corpulent. Fuck. And... Sorry, guys. So I've been having terrible sinus issues for the past, I don't know, year and a half. And... it's getting slightly better right this instant because I'm taking a ton of allergy medicine. But it was way worse over the weekend, and I got sick before that. So now there's like, I don't know, I'm just having blockage and it's making things harder to pronounce, and I have to like adjust all of my technique around my fucking nose. It's really ridiculous. And right there, he decided he was done trying to train Fergs who skulked in the shadows, hiding from him, avoiding their assemblies, quietly trying to fatten up their commander so he would be too corpulent to stake them all for their ineptitude. As such, Shale started stalking up the hall, looking for the exit. After many convoluted turns through the twisted maze his weakling underlings had given to him to oversee... After many convoluted turns through the twisted maze his weakling underlings had given to him to oversee, Shale found another group of softling Fergs huddled by the exit, staring... After many convoluted turns through the twisted maze his weakling underlings had given to him to oversee, Shale found another group of softling Fergs huddled by the exit, staring with wide, terrified eyes at the outside, a barrier of broken... After many convoluted turns through the twisted maze his weakling underlings had given to him to oversee, Shale found another group of softling Fergs huddled by the exit, staring with wide, terrified eyes at the outside, a barrier of broken glass between them and the open air. They saw him approach from the shadows of the corridor, noticed the fury in their commander's face, and huddled in on themselves in panic, blubbering like Melah. Shale snorted and moved past them, too. He had made it several digs before he realized the glass was cutting through his scales. Confused, Shale glanced down at his coils. The normal red of his powerful body had been replaced by a soft, fleshy pink. Something seemed to twist in Shale's mind as he stared down at himself, a connection that burned as he tried to make sense of it. It took Shale several long moments of staring before he realized what had been done to him.
The cowards descaled me?
His chest clenched so hard it hurt. Beneath his coils, crimson blood began to seep into the glass, yet his body, now soft and pink, bore the truth of the horror. They had descaled him in his sleep. Descaled him. Heart hammering, Shale reached up to his chest, trying to find the tech sheath between the large, fleshy lumps that had been revealed by the descaling. His tech sheath, too, had been sewn shut, his fingers not even finding the opening.
I'll kill them all,
Shale thought, horror mingling with shame.
No wonder they had left him in his bed and fled. One of the deserters had defiled him. Of course they would run. They rightly feared his wrath. By the graves of my ancestors! Shale swore, watching his blood leak out to slowly puddle between the glass shards. I will gather my clan and hunt down every weakling who ran from me this day and hang their techs and their children's techs to dry upon my wall. He turned to glance behind him at the soft-bodied skulkers. They had made no move to run like the others, and he recognized none of their faces, so he decided to let them live. Scowling, he turned back to the exit and kept moving. More glass punctured his coils, but he ignored it. A warrior could withstand pain. A warrior could withstand pain. Once he was out in the light, Shale hesitated. He peered up at the alien sky, curious at the odd yellow ball. On Welu, the skies were constantly writhing with green, blue, red, pink, and yellow strands of color, even during the daylight. Here, it was just a solid blue, with what appeared to be a sliver of a moon or nearby planet in the distance. Odd how he couldn't remember seeing anything similar to this upon his arrival on the planet. Again, his mind began to heat and buzz uncomfortably, the headache that followed quickly forcing him to focus on other thoughts. Shale needed a ship. He'd wasted enough time with these soft-bodied weaklings. They were too useless to learn the ways of the Dreet. One could sooner haul a Melah from its herd and slap a spear between its jaws than teach these tiny, ignorant bipeds anything about war. Shale set out across the textured flat stone, seeking a skimmer that could take him to a spaceport. It was time for him to go home. There were plenty of skimmers laid out on the square of stone, interspersed between primitive alien land-going vehicles, but none of them. Shale set out across the textured flat stone, seeking a skimmer that could take him to a spaceport. It was time for him to go home. There were plenty of skimmers laid out on the square of stone, interspersed between primitive alien land-going vehicles, but none of them would respond to Shale's commands. It appeared that the skulkers here were afraid of theft, something that was a staking offense. It appeared that the skulkers here were afraid of theft, something that was a staking offense on Welu. Even Shale, having been descaled and his tech disabled by those he had counted as his allies, would have paid a spaceport attendant to return the skimmer to where he found it once he was done with it. Frustrated, Shale set off along the alien pathway, scanning the thin vegetation on either side for any hint as to where the spaceport would be located. The sporadic undergrowth, tiny trees, and dry grasses were nothing like the thick, vibrant, life-sustaining vegetation of The sporadic undergrowth, tiny The sporadic undergrowth, tiny trees, and dry grasses were nothing like the thick, vibrant, life-sustaining vegetation of Welu's great swamps and jungles. Jungles. The sporadic undergrowth, tiny trees, and dry grasses were nothing like the thick, vibrant, life-sustaining vegetation of Welu's great swamps and jungles. His snout twisted with disgust. The Fergs must have been desperate to live in an ugly, barren place like this. He continued down the dirt path until he reached another section of flat stone, this one stretching as far as the eye could see in either direction. Shale hesitated, not knowing enough about this miserable planet to pick the proper direction to the spaceport. He glanced at the sky, expecting some sort of traffic overhead, but the place seemed oddly empty. Almost lifeless. Shale's scale pores tightened as he realized he could hear nothing but alien pests and the wind. Where is everyone? He thought, confused. This was supposed to be a great empire, one with massive militaries and incredible commerce, yet as Shale stood there in the middle of their road, staring at their sky, he saw nothing. Faced with such alien terrain, such silence, Shale supposed he could go back and wait for his less craven subordinates to return and pay for their brethren's betrayal with a ride to the spaceport. Perhaps they would even bring him food. Ruled by your stomach like a tacky, he thought, disgusted at his weakness. Still, it had been some time since his servants had fed him last. His great body felt almost weak.
All right, more water. Be right back.
His great body felt almost weak. When he looked behind him at the way he had come, Shale saw that the entrance to his training facility had been sunk into a mountainside. Leading up to it were patches of glistening red where Shale had passed. The color seemed odd to him. He had bled before, and it had always been blue. Again, he felt that painful heat in his head as he tried to assimilate what he was seeing with what he knew. It didn't make sense. How did one's blood go from being blue to being red? It took him some time this time to make the connection. Drugs, he realized, making the painful heat clear immediately. Perhaps his betrayers had injected him with some alien drug, but something that... Perhaps his betrayers had injected him with some alien drug, something that had altered his perceptions to better their escape. Cowards, Shale thought, with a rising fury. He had always known they had been afraid of him. It had been in their looks, their flinches whenever Dr. Phillip came to feed him. And, sure enough, not one of his underlings had shown his face since he had discovered their treachery. He glanced back at the wide swath of primitive stone roadway. On undeveloped alien worlds, roads led to settlements, and settlements had food. Shale, whose stomach was even then spasming in hunger, his body growing dizzy with need, decided that only a Voran would skulk around in a cave, waiting for his underlings to feed him. Thus, he decided he would feed himself, and should any of the primitive landowners object, he would simply kill them as blood debt to their betrayer weakling cousins. At this point, all the skulkers were accountable. Shale's coils started to burn the longer he slid along the Shale's coils started to burn the longer he slid along the alien roadway until, despite his natural dread immunity to all but extreme heat, his wounded undersides Shale's coils started to burn the longer he slid along the alien roadway until, despite his natural dread immunity to all but extreme heat, his wounded undersides began to blister. The bleeding, despite his body's normally rapid healing, had not slowed. Worse, he was having great pain in his abdomen, and when he looked down, there was blood running down his coils from some unknown wound in his guts. They poisoned me, Shale thought, disgusted. He was actually beginning to have trouble staying upright, his perceptions zoning in and out of his war mind as he found himself having more and more trouble concentrating. Eventually, as the sun hit its zenith and the horridly bright alien day, Shale fell out of his war mind altogether. His skin, scaleless for the first time in his life, felt much too hot. Its pale color transformed to an almost red. He stumbled into the shade, stunned that he was forced to. They made me weak, he thought, his fury overriding even his exhaustion. They made me weak, he thought. The sun, the glass, the stone, none of it should have affected him in his normal state. Yet here he was, hiding in the shadows like a voggy skulker, panting like an overworked tacky. He was coiled in the shade, trying desperately to stay conscious when he heard the voices of weaklings along the road. He sat up, realizing this was his chance to get directions, and maybe a ride, to a spaceport. 3 weaklings were approaching, striding down the center of the roadway, carrying backpacks and bristling with primitive weaponry. They had odd slouches and swaggers to their walk, nothing at all like Dr. Phillip, and Shale realized these might be this planet's warrior class. "I am Shale Gawelu," he announced, struggling upright. "I am Shale Gawelu," he announced. "Prince of Welu, leader of the clan Welu, on the name of my ancestors, I offer you trade with my clan and 2 9 standard Ruvmestan coins for transportation to Welu." He had to steady himself on a flimsy alien tree to fight the sudden dizziness that came with rising. The 3 soft, delicate, cloth-covered aliens stopped in the road and stood there. The three soft, delicate, cloth-covered aliens stopped in the road and stood there, staring at his great body like Fergs seeing an Ureki temple for the first time. One of them turned to his friends and said something that sounded much like the foul tongue of Shale's treacherous underlings, which sparked a new wave of fury into it. One of them turned to his friends and said something that sounded much like the foul tongue of Shale's treacherous underlings, which sparked a new wave of fury in his soul. They mock me, he thought, remembering his lack of scales. He had to fight the instinct to kill them for their slight. "Welu?" the darker one said. Then they babbled something to themselves, and the 2 of them laughed. The darker one pointed at Shale. "Welu? Welu?" The weakling then pointed at himself, grinning ear to ear. The weakling then pointed at himself, grinning ear to ear. Welu? Welu? The weakling then pointed. Master. You spelled it ma, but it seems like he would be saying master.
So phonetically, it is master, yes, but it was an attempt to like hide it in the text.
Oh, I see. Master. The useless Ferg wanted to exchange pleasantries. Shale could tell by the imbecilic smiles on their faces, however, that their simple minds were overwhelmed at the idea of a great Welu prince deigning to talk to them. Because it was all he could do not to wrap one of them in his coils as a lesson to the others, Shale grated. Because it was all he could do not to wrap one of them in his coils as a lesson to the others, Shale grated. Yes, I want to go to Welu. You will be paid well for your services. The Fergs laughed some more. One of the larger ones shook his head and jabbered something in the pathetic softling tongue, then jabbed a thumb at himself and said, Master. Take me to a spaceport, Master, Shale snarled, fed up with their stalling. Or you shall feel the wrath of my coils before your eyes burst from your oily, useless head for the wrongs that your brethren did to me. Or you shall feel the wrath of my coils before your eyes burst from your oily, useless head for the wrongs that your brethren did to me. The three underlings snickered and glanced at each other. As Shale stood there in growing rage, one of them pointed at him and laughed something in the alien tongue. The other two cackled like Ueshi on Carweek bulbs. The other two cackled like Ueshi on Carweek bulbs. The other two cackled like Ueshi on Carweek bulbs. Fury burning in the core of his tech, Shale lashed out and put his fist around the closest alien's neck, intending to heave him off the ground and throw him into the forest to educate his mindless friends. Prepare for your journey through the 90 hells, weakling! He snarled. He heaved. The alien remained firmly in place, and oddly, Shale found himself looking up at the aliens, almost as if they had grown larger by his getting closer. What treachery is this? Shale's panicked mind cried. He tried to remember some alien that could change form, alter its size. All he could come up with was the White. Who could only produce a body of equal mass or less. Nothing, as far as he knew, could grow. Even more disturbing, the now giant alien took hold of his hand and wrenched it from his throat as easily as if Shale were a stunted hatchling. The weakling's glacial blue eyes, bigger than a dreet's, more suited to the crude hunter-gatherer lifestyle of their ancestors, were like twin chips of ice in his face as he grabbed both of Shale's hands and jerked them in front of him, then pulled him close and leaned down to speak his linguistic dirt into his face. There was no mistaking the malice in the creature's cold tone, despite the fact that Shale could not understand their filthy tongue. Shale snorted. You threaten me? He attempted to jerk his hands free, but the drugs his betrayers had fed him had left him too weak to hurl the lesser creature away from him. Grinning, showing his crooked, flat teeth, his assailant wrapped his big hand, bigger than Shale's, he realized in horror, around his wrists, and started pulling something out of his pocket, laughing with his fellows. Upon seeing the rope, Shale stared at it, uncomprehending. When it became clear that they intended to use the flimsy strands on him, Shale just laughed. Only a Ferg would be... Only a Ferg would be stupid enough to bind a Dreet warrior, he declared. If the Voggy understood him or cared, they made no sign. Instead, they wrenched his arms behind his back, and Shale felt the sharp bite of ropes digging into his scaleless skin. Instead, they wrenched his arms behind his back, and Shale felt the sharp bite of ropes digging into his scaleless skin.
So you had somebody compliment your app in YouTube.
Oh, nice. Oh, nice. Atako. Yeah, we made a concerted effort to make it highly accessible to the visually impaired. So I'm really glad you were satisfied with it. There's a lot of people who are. Did I say hearing impaired? Visually impaired. I meant visually impaired if I said hearing.
I think you said visually.
Okay. Yeah, we have, a lot of fans who are blind or visually impaired, so we wanted to make sure to take care of them. So glad to hear that you liked it. If you want to volunteer to continue giving us feedback or give suggestions about the app, then please email us at info@soundbooththeater.com or support@soundbooththeater.com. You can, send compliments or send suggestions or tell us about any bugs that you found, or if you know of a way that we've done something that you've seen it done better. Any of that is we're watching out for any feedback like that. So thanks again. And also, if you could please, anyone who uses the app and really likes it, please give us reviews in the app store that you got it from. A lot of our reviews are from our first iteration of the app that really didn't turn out to be very good. So it would help us a lot and bring up our numbers if you left positive reviews. That is, if you feel positively about the app. Almost a rotation after the Ureki Asher running the Space Force decided to open up on Earth 3 days early, Joe woke with the weird urge to go north when he had originally been planning to head west towards San Diego. He packed up the remnants of his latest kill, the near-rancid hindquarters of a feral animal that he was pretty sure had been a pig, and went west anyway because the cities collected Kreenit, and there were reports of at least 6 females digging dens along the ocean. Joe had made it about 20 digs when he remembered what had happened. The last time he was in San Diego. 4 soot-wad Fergs had taken one look at his Kongi blacks, saw his high-tech weaponry, realized they couldn't take it from him, and spat on him instead. This while Joe had been smiling, his hand out in the typical North American Earth greeting, another dead Kreenit twitching on the ground behind him. Still marching west, Joe stopped in his tracks. In the rotation since he'd landed, Joe had killed 22 Kreenit, more than any man had a right to kill, and yet just a drop in the bucket compared to how many had been left on Earth, or how many would be born the moment all those pregnant Kreenit had their young, thoughtfully inseminated en route by overzealous Kongi peacemakers. It was a thankless, endless battle, and he was growing damned tired of it. He glanced west. Plenty more Kreenit out there, waiting to meet Jane.
Plenty more Kreenit out there, waiting to meet Jane. Plenty of people to save. Plenty of Fergs to spit on him and curse him as if Kongis were responsible for Earth's current tacky screw. He glanced north.
I mean, they are.
Not the military, though. And honestly, it was humans being humans that got everybody banned from Congress.
They should be. I mean, why would you want to be part of Congress?
They
invaded the planet and took their 6-year-olds through 12-year-olds. Everything that the humans are doing is nothing compared to what Congress has done to them.
Yeah, but
He glanced north.
Joe, I mean, they wouldn't even have the capability to go invade other planets if it weren't for Congress coming in the first place.
He glanced north.
But when faced with overwhelming odds and completely, they had absolutely no way of winning, and they decided to try anyway.
Yeah,
and
good.
that's
Good.
Fucking stupid.
Oh,
Fucking
well.
stupid. But anyway, that was
trying to put a boot on your neck. I mean,
that was Earth that
north.
did that.
That did what?
It was human ego that did that.
That got them invaded by Congress.
No, that got them shat on with the Kreenit.
No. They wouldn't even. That's so crazy. I don't even know what to say.
He glanced north.
All right. Joe had no idea what was due north. It was mountainous, looked wild, and it hadn't been. It was mountainous. Fuck my nose! It was mountainous. It was mountainous, looked wild, and it hadn't been in his carefully thought-out plan to spend the rest of his life crisscrossing the North American continent with the love of his life attached to his hip. Fuck, need more water. So far, every type of alien besides humans have been much worse than humans as far as behavior. Except
Precisely.
maybe the
Jahul and the
the Jahul and the Iweshi. Yes.
Uechi. And also the Aihi are pretty tame. But I mean, if you're faced with entities that have like thousands of planets, and you know that they will slaughter you to a man the moment you piss them off, and they jump at that opportunity, why would you do something that would put your entire planet in danger just to see if you could?
You gotta get the boot off your neck somehow. Let's see. Joe had no idea what was due north. Their alternative is to just be farm animals. Due north. It was mountainous, looked wild, and it hadn't been in his carefully thought-out plan to spend the rest of his life crisscrossing the North American continent with... Fuck! It was mountainous, looked wild, and it hadn't been in his carefully thought-out plan to spend the rest of his life crisscrossing the North American continent with the love of his life attached to his hip. He'd planned to do a rough half-circle, starting with San Francisco, following the coast down to Mexico City, then doubling back through Dallas, and finally taking the coast up and ending with New York City. He figured that's about as long as he could hope to live before he grew too old to fight, and the coasts always had the biggest cities. But humans, ungrateful ferglings that they were, wouldn't care if he killed 10 Kreenit or 10,000 Kreenit.
Joe had quickly discovered that they thought the only good Kongi was a dead Kongi, and in an entire rotation, Joe hadn't met a single Earthling that hadn't tried to A. kill him, B. spit on him, or C. tell him to go back home. It was right then that Joe stopped and kind of blinked, realizing he'd been mopping up Earth's mess for the last rotation, to absolutely no fanfare or any sort of gratitude. Remembering the hateful stares of the men and women he had just saved, telling him to get off their planet, Joe decided that the human race could afford to spend a few turns rolling in its own flake while he explored. Thus, Joe was heading north, bristling with weapons, about to tackle the necessary evil of crossing a road, when he heard the raucous laughter of several men, as well as a woman's indignant screams, and sighed. He knew the routine. He'd busted up dozens of such parties since Judgment, and it was beginning to wear on him. The females of this planet, raised with pillows and primping and perfumes, had no recourse when the low-life scumbags... Scumbags? Fucking knows, man. The females of this planet, raised with pillows and primping and perfumes, had no recourse when the low-life scumbags, suddenly free of all the rules and restrictions of society, started doing things like forming tribes, claiming women and taking slaves. Tugging Jane off his belt, he went to investigate. Around the bend in the road... Around the bend in the road, two tall white men and their tawny-skinned, shorter male companion were standing out in the open on the sun-baked asphalt, shoving a small, naked woman back and forth between them as she stumbled and screamed in terror. They'd shaved the poor girl's hair to the scalp, removed every fiber of her clothes, and bound her hands behind her back, obviously in yet another bid to start up a slave trade with what was left of the dwindling human race. Joe sighed and approached through the brush, staying out of sight of the three thugs. Upon getting close enough to see the woman's fierce expression, however, Joe did a double-take. No, he thought, seeing her bared teeth, lips raised in a snarl, the utterly savage look on her face. He was pretty sure that was fury, not fear. His heart actually gave a startled thump, having seen familiar ferociousness in wild Drate. Drate, right? That's right. His heart actually gave a startled thump, having seen His heart actually gave a startled thump, having seen similar ferociousness in wild Drate right before they ripped men in half. On the road, the three men laughed as they manhandled their prize. Oh, I'm not gonna do her. Shove. Shove. She's bleeding, man. You do her. I get the next one. Nope. Hold on, let me go find their voices from earlier. What did I do with these guys? Welu? Welu? Master. Master. Take me. No, I'm not gonna do her. Shut. She's bleeding, man. You do her. I get the next one. She's hairy as my mother's poodle, the Hispanic snorted. The Hispanic man or Hispanic? Okay. She's hairy as my mother's poodle. There we go. The Hispanic snorted. To hell with that! You do her! Shove. His other Caucasian friend laughed. And let her bite me? Dude, she took a chunk out of your ear, man. Fuck that shit. Shove. Joe sighed and raised Jane to take aim. He was about to put a blast through something essential when a string of invectives stopped him dead in his tracks, making his hair stand utterly on end.
"Sniveling tacky skulkers!" the woman shrieked. I'll make you all dance on my tech like the craven weaklings you are! Release me! Fight like warriors, you scaleless alien filth, where your mother's impregnated with the shit of tacky! Fight me!
The words sounded old, very old, and it took Joe a moment to understand why. When he did, his heart gave a startled thump, then stopped entirely. She's speaking ancient Dreet. She's speaking ancient Dreet. He thought, stunned. His plasma pistol lowered another few inches as he stared. How he knew that, or how he knew it was Welu by the odd lisp of some of her softer consonants, left him just as disconcerted as the way the words seemed to be rolling off her tongue as if they belonged to her. Kind of like Joe.
She acts rabid,
the Hispanic man was saying. He shoved her back to the others. He'd already been bitten at least once, and he was holding a hand to the side of his bloody face. When they tried to shove her back to him, he held up a crimson palm.
Dude, she's not worth our time. Gotta be some foreigner or something. Maybe some mail-order bride that's... Maybe some mail-order bride that escaped, you know? Doesn't understand a word we're saying. We should leave her.
I'm not gonna do... I want my rope back. I want my rope back. I want my rope back. Irene in the middle growled, That's military grade. That's military grade. High-tech Kongi stuff. I'm not leaving it with her. Fine, man, the Hispanic said. He shoved the girl back to him so hard she fell to her bruised and bloodied knees. He shoved the girl back to him so hard she fell to her bruised and bloody knees. Well, you want the rope, you untie her. He took a pointed step backwards. From the ground, the tiny woman screamed.
I will hunt down your ancestors and shit on their graves!
Again, in ancient Dreet. Again, in ancient Dreet. She struggled to get back to her feet. The tall Caucasian man behind her grabbed her shoulder and shoved her back down. Fine, you guys don't want her. There's better pickings out there. The wicked little she-bitch doesn't need to live. Then he grabbed the projectile gun on his hip and placed the old steel barrel to the back of her head. The woman, oblivious, kept cursing his manhood and his... The woman, oblivious, kept cursing his manhood and his heritage. The click of the hammer cocking broke Joe out of his shock. Even as the man's finger was starting to squeeze, he surged out of the trees, caught the shooter by the elbow, and shoved the gun away from the girl's head. As the gun went off in reflex, startling everyone, Joe broke the man's arm, then his wrist, then his fingers as he twisted the gun in his hand. Then he swiveled, threw the man over his shoulder, brought a heel down on his throat, and, as his blue eyes were going wide and he started to choke, put one of Jane's wayward children through his skull, disintegrating the upper half of his head into the pavement. As the dead man's two thuggish friends were recovering enough to scream and stumble backwards, Joe casually raised the gun over the woman's head to level on them. He was well aware that he wasn't even breaking a sweat, and, dressed in the all-black alien attire of a Kongi, he might as well have been a white assassin to the two Fergs in front of them. They stared at him like he was a demon from the Dreet Hells. Into the silence, Joe said,
"I know you two have the mental density of a Fergling fart."
He hesitated, leveling Jane on their faces individually.
"But I'll put this into terms you can understand. You're going to run. The one who does that the fastest lives. The other one, the slower one, I'm going to shoot, skin, and use his hide for a new belt. Ready? Go."
The two men, boys, really, bolted, throwing each other to the bolted, throwing each other to the ground as they each tried to escape faster than their companion, taking completely different directions in their bid for survival. The two men, boys really, bolted, throwing each other to the ground as they each tried to escape faster than their companion, taking completely different directions in their bid for survival. Sighing, Joe waited until he could no longer hear their frantic feet rushing through the undergrowth, then lowered Jane. The two men lowered Jane.
"You okay there, sister? You okay there, sister? You okay there, sister? You okay there, sister?"
There we go.
"You okay there, sister?"
Jane.
"You okay there, sister?"
He, unfortunately, did not know how to flip his odd Dreet habit on, so all he could do was give her soothing gestures and sounds in Kongi. The woman twisted to scowl up at him, a spreading bruise swelling one eye shut, making it clear that someone had punched her in the face. Joe gave her a commiserating grin.
"Sorry I couldn't get here faster."
In a sneer of complete disdain, the woman said in perfect Welu Dreet, "I'm going to return with my clan and annihilate this pitiful shithole."
"Yeah,"
Joe said, squatting beside her.
"Sorry about the ash bags. Let me see how bad they hit you."
He reached for her face. The wounded girl lunged up, drove her head into his chest, knocked him backwards on his ass, then, with a rabid snarl, she sank her teeth into his hand like a Dreet sinking his fangs into a steak.
"Ow! Burn! Ow! Ow! Burn! Ow!"
Joe shouted, recoiling from her.
"Let go! Let go!"
Despite Joe's repeated, desperate tugging, however, she held on like a Dasha hatchling with its first meal, falling backwards onto the asphalt to get better leverage. Then, to his horror, she started to ragdoll his hand like she wanted to tear it off. As she did so, she began jamming a foot into his abdomen, probably seeking his nuts. Joe had to kick her violently away from him to get his hand out of her mouth. Then he clambered backwards and blinked down at the puncture marks she had put into his poly-nanite gloves, panting. The only reason he hadn't lost fingers was the sleek black Kongi technology, which was even then sealing the wounds she had put into it. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about his hand. He could feel it throbbing underneath the glove. He could feel it throbbing underneath the glove, warm wetness oozing against his skin. The woman was getting back on her knees, licking his blood off her lips, with a fearsome crimson grin, said, Next time, your heart, skulker." again, in perfect Wailudreet. The insult, combined with his wounded hand, combined with the woman who was now licking his blood off her lips, sent a jolt of adrenaline burning through Joe's system that left him somewhere between rage and panic.
Next time.
Damn it.
I just saved your life!
He cried, pointing at the headless man sprawled on the asphalt, broken fingers still tangled in his primitive gun. Instead of repenting and apologizing, the woman sneered and slowly looked him up and down as if he had suddenly and liberally covered himself in shit.
A Vorin.
No, I'm a...
Then Joe realized he was, indeed, speaking Vorendreet. Because he really didn't have a comeback for that, he said,
I'm going to free you. That's it, okay? Sister's bloody tex.
He said,
I'm going to free you.
She continued to look at him as if he were dressed in his own filth. Continued to look at him as if he were dressed.
I don't need a Vorin's help. Go back to twining your hatchmates.
She stood regally and started to walk away, arms still tied securely behind her back with that handy Kongi death line. Death line, because once a good knot was tied, your enemy was going to starve to death before he ever went anywhere. Joe narrowed his eyes. She obviously had a few screws loose, possibly was even carrying some sort of weird earth disease. Logic dictated that he should let her trundle off to die. Joe, however, was pissed. She'd bit him. With his much longer legs, he stalked ahead of the woman and stopped in her path, giving her the choice of halting or falling flat on her much smaller ass as she barreled into him. She stopped, scowling at the body armor covering his chest as if she was wondering if she could bite through it, too. Glaring down at her, Joe said,
I just saved your life. The least you could do is not burning bite me while I free your damn hands.
In reply, the woman dropped into a crouch on the asphalt and grinned up at him with predatory challenge. Meeting that feral gaze, listening to her animal snarl, Joe felt his heart give a painful hammer. She was, he realized, not acting human. Seeing that, what he wanted to do was grab his stuff and ditch her there, her teeth bared like she wanted to sink her canines into his throat. But because his mother had always said he was a good guy, if a bit of a dumb shit, and because leaving the girl with her hands tied was a death sentence, and, most of all, because God hated a coward, Joe decided to help her out.
Don't bite me,
Joe growled, scowling at her. She snarled back, emerald eyes filled with a mingling of disdain and challenge. She snarled back, emerald eyes filled with a mingling of disdain and challenge. She looked, quite frankly, like some wild, vicious alien that Joe had spent most of his life killing.
Don't,
he warned. When she just continued to show her bloody teeth like a feral thing, Joe approached with the intent of again squatting beside her and freeing her hands. Before he could get all the way down, she lunged up and attempted to... Before he could get all the way down, she lunged up and attempted to slam her forehead into his. Though her much smaller head impacting his cranium wouldn't have knocked him cold, Joe's startled upward lunge to avoid her... Though her much smaller head impacting his cranium wouldn't have knocked him cold, Joe's startled upward lunge to avoid her, followed by his stumble over the dead man's leg, followed by his long downward arc terminating in the back of his skull hitting the asphalt, did. The last thing he saw before he hit the ground was the woman's satisfied smirk as she stood and started sauntering off in the direction of her would-be assailants. When Joe woke, he was pissed. No, beyond pissed. Fuming. Not only had the woman bit him, headbutted him, tried to crush the family jewels, and left him to bake in the California sun, but she'd left Jane to bake in the California sun, exposed on the abandoned highway for any drooling Ferg with a gun fetish to wander along and take for himself. And that was sacrilege. And all this after Joe had rescued the Jen Fergling woman. All he'd tried to do was help her. What was worse, Joe still didn't know how the naked Ferg spoke Dreet. And she had insulted him. And she seemed completely oblivious to the fact he'd saved her life. Not even a damn thank you. Joe scowled in the direction she'd taken, her bloody footprints browning on the asphalt. He could have walked away. She hadn't taken any of his stuff. In fact, the rabid Fergling had left all of his gear right there in the middle of the street, like she didn't even want or need survival supplies, meat, emergency rations, body armor, spare clothes. Yet he definitely could have walked away.
Yes, he definitely could have.
Yes, he definitely could have walked away. But she had bit him, and she'd mistreated Jane. That was unacceptable. Ready to go to war, Joe snagged up the dead man's gun, added it to his growing collection, and followed her. He found her naked, sun-broiled body face down on the asphalt after a 30-minute jog, her naked back exposed to the sky. The Ferg woman hadn't even had the brains to get out of the sun. For a minute, Joe thought she was dead, and he experienced a weird pang of regret as he looked at her motionless body. Almost like he'd missed an important debriefing or forgotten to take his allotted leave. Then, as his eyes settled on the strange barcode tattooed into her neck, he also noticed the shallow rise and fall of her shoulders against the hot tar. Again, Joe realized he could have left her there. His hand still throbbed where she'd bit him, and he was going to have to administer nanos to help himself that night if his head didn't stop spinning from where she had introduced it to the pavement. Besides, it wasn't like he hadn't seen a million other women die in his lifetime. Good women. Ones that didn't bite or leave him to die on the tarmac. What was the life of one tiny, utterly crazy chick back on Earth? Yet Joe couldn't get over the fact she'd called him a skulker, in perfect Waylu Dreet. And he'd understood it. Not even Davine, in his crude, misguided attempts to sober him up, had called him a skulker. It was one of the worst one-word insults in the Dreet language, used only on creatures that could never, in a million years, be considered warriors, and for some reason, coming from her lips after he'd broken a guy's wrist to save her, it really pissed him off. This time, when Joe got down to untie her, she never stirred. He yanked the knots loose first. Her hands were starting to darken dangerously where the Fergs had cut off circulation, then coiled the rope and tucked it into his backpack. Then, after nudging her with a foot to make sure she wouldn't leap up and attack him again, he bent down, threw her unconscious body over his shoulder, and went looking for some shade. Though Joe generally avoided houses as resting places due to the way Kreenit habitually liked to rip them open to get to the Though Joe generally avoided houses as resting places due to the way Kreenit habitually liked to rip them open to get to the morsels inside, the girl was obviously in need of clothes and some bed rest. He found a small, inconspicuous house tucked amidst a couple of hills. He found a small, inconspicuous house tucked amidst a couple hills, a shattered wooden pen of weed-ridden, trampled dirt, all that remained of some unknown domestic animal. Humans, Joe realized, his fingers tracing the massive claw marks in one of the shattered fence posts, were going to have a damn hard time making a comeback. If any domesticated animals actually survived the hunger of their keepers, with Kreenit around, raising livestock was like painting a bullseye on your back. Within a few more rotations, humanity would be, quite literally, back to its hunter-gatherer days. Unlike the pen, however, the house had survived relatively unscathed. It seemed as though whatever the Kreenit had eaten inside the fence had satiated it enough that it had only knocked... It seemed as though whatever the Kreenit had eaten inside the fence had satiated it enough that it had only knocked down one corner as an afterthought, leaving the rest of the well-built old farm... It seemed as though whatever the Kreenit had eaten inside the fence had satiated it enough that it had only knocked down one corner as an afterthought, leaving the rest of the well-built old farmhouse still standing. Lowering the girl to the ground in the grass, Joe got out his heat-imaging binoculars and took a look at the building itself. Though he could see several rats chewing away at something in the downstairs closet, there were no telltale red blobs of a human presence. Returning his binoculars to his pack, he once more shouldered the girl and started toward the house. Entering through the gaping hole beside the kitchen, Joe paused on the tile floor and listened. Hearing nothing but the skitter of rats beside the stove, smelling nothing but rancid lard, he went upstairs, looking for a bed. The first room at the top of the stairs had 6 sleeping bags laid out in haphazard disarray on the floor, with rudimentary survival gear scattered around each bag.
Original taco, yes. Surrendal gore. Dungeon Crawler Carl. The original taco asked, I'm curious, have any authors ever purposely used difficult-to-pronounce names or words to mess with you?
With rudimentary survival gear scattered around each bag. The far side of the room was open to the air, the wall missing where something huge had lunged through it. Seeing the brown stains spattering the room, Joe grimaced. Apparently the penned animal hadn't been the only thing the Kreenit had snacked on. In the next room over, it was the same. A big band had stopped here, possibly as many as 24, and the floors of every room were covered in sleeping bags, the wall dismantled, every surface covered in dried blood.
It attacked in their sleep,
Joe thought with a grimace. Another reason why he avoided abandoned houses like the plague. Once you were inside, there was nowhere to run. In a bedroom on the opposite end of the house, the end of the house still standing, Joe found a bed that looked cleaner than the rest and lowered the woman into it. First, he treated her sunburn, reluctantly administering a good portion of his topical nanite cream. Then he went about finding her some clothes. He avoided the greasy, flea-ridden belongings of the unlucky band and focused on the relatively unscathed storage closet in a nearby bedroom. From what he could find in the mothball-smelling dresser drawers, the house had belonged to a really skinny old man and his similarly old, but very fat, companion. Joe grabbed a few sets of the old man's clothes, figuring too tall would be better than falling completely off, sliced off the bottoms of the legs, the arms, and the hem of the shirt, then fitted the clothes over the woman's body as she dozed. After he'd gotten her pants on, he paused. The girl's feet, it seemed, were still oozing pus and blood from wounds that looked a hell of a lot worse than she could have done running over a few sticks to escape her captors. Frowning, he pulled out his flashlight to get a better look. He thought the first translucent sliver was a piece of plastic clinging to her. Soul until it pricked his hand when he tried to get a grip on it. Glass? He grunted with surprise. She must have walked several lengths with glass embedded in her feet. That was odd. Even odder was the barcode he had found on the back of her neck. Once he'd picked the glass from her feet and sealed up the wounds with nanotape, he rolled her onto her side to get a better look. It wasn't an angsty, for fun tattoo either. It was an expensive government gene mod, the cells producing their own jet black pigment, much like the glowing Planops tattoo on his left hand. Curious now, Joe pulled out his black market PPU and scanned it. The barcode read SHAEL V2.0.6. Seeing that, Joe had the gut-twisting horror that he was dealing with some sort of cyborg. Carefully, so as not to disturb her, he started checking telltale signs, pulling her lips back to check the gum line for metal, prying underneath the nails to look for data ports, pulling back the ears to check for transmitters, massaging the stomach to feel for hard machinery. Nothing. To all appearances, he was dealing with a perfectly healthy human girl, maybe 20 turns old, shaved head, vivid green eyes, bad attitude. When Joe looked again at the tattoo, he noticed a discoloration on her neck, beneath the gene mod. Another tattoo, but this one was an older, smaller one he hadn't seen on first glance, a barely visible, faded gray ink job that hadn't been renewed in decades. It read simply, 665.
Who the hell are you?
Joe thought, covering the tattoos and standing back to watch her sleep. She spoke Dreet. She acted Dreet, and she carried a tattoo that marked her as some sort of android or computer program. That was what V2.0.6 meant, wasn't it? Joe frowned, wishing his Boggin or White friends were there so he could ask them. Technology had never been his strong suit. After it became apparent that she was going to continue to sleep, Joe decided to see what he could scavenge from the kitchen. The first thing he found, upon checking the stove, was a massive pot of large, rancid bones that someone had brought in from outside. It still had scorch marks up the sides from someone's campfire. In the bottom, there was a thick layer of spoiled lard covering the surface of what looked to be some sort of stew. Doubtless the remnants of the unfortunate group's last meal. Once again reminded why he never stayed the night in an abandoned houses, Joe went looking for something to supplement the quickly spoiling meal from the unidentified earth animal he had shot. What? I don't remember him shooting an animal. When did that happen?
It was before he met Shale. It was mentioned that he had jerky in his pockets, his bags.
Okay. I missed it.
Once again reminded why he never stayed the night in abandoned houses, Joe went looking for something to supplement the quickly spoiling meat from the unidentified earth animal he had shot. He really didn't want to have to break into his survival rations unless he absolutely had to, especially not for an ungrateful Ferg who would bid him. Scavenging, for Joe, was always hit or miss. Even though he had been on Earth a full rotation already, Joe was still trying to get a grasp on the dizzying array of Earth foods and what was good for what. He opened up the cabinets and found himself entirely out of his league. He could identify some of the spices, oregano and rosemary especially, since the Areki had begun a massive trade of it for their perfume industry, but most of the actual foodstuffs were utterly incomprehensible to him. What was worse, boxes and canisters of pre-made foods were already ransacked, leaving only the basics behind. He found a tub of sugar hidden behind some kitchen appliances on the counter, which he immediately grabbed. Sugar, he had discovered, after 74 turns away from home, was delicious. Other Earth foods, however, were not so desirable. Flour just made a pasty, tasteless mess in his mouth. Cornmeal was the same. Baking soda was absolutely disgusting. Canned foods were generally good, ostensibly because it took so many more resources to preserve them. Therefore, humans would only expend the extra effort on the more valuable and tasty foodstuffs. Unfortunately, the good stuff in this place had obviously been picked clean by the human scavengers who had met their untimely end upstairs. Whereas a Kreenit would simply eat can, wrapper, and contents whole, these cans had been carefully cut open, emptied, and discarded in a haphazard pile in one corner of the kitchen. Even then, the reek of old fly larvae still... Even then, the reek of old fly larvae still stank up the kitchen from the heap. Not that the pot of bones was any better. Joe had to hold his hand over his mouth each time he walked past it to keep from gagging. As soon as the girl was awake, he was going to get them somewhere much less tempting to a predator's delicate palate. He was actually surprised that the house hadn't been ransacked a second time by a Kreenit looking for the source of the rancid meat. Skirting the stove, Joe found some flour and cornmeal in the cupboards, but he left it behind, having found little use for the stuff. There was a canister marked beans in the cabinet over the sink, filled with little glossy... There was a canister marked beans in the cabinet over the sink, filled with little glossy red nodules, but when Joe tried to bite into them, not only were they incredibly hard, but they tasted bitter and disgusting. He tossed the canister aside, irritated with humanity. At least the rest of Congress knew how to eat well. The Ueshi, especially, with their very short lives and extremely big brains, knew how to live it up. They wouldn't have put up with this tasteless crap. Not that Joe's foggy memories of childhood on Earth dredged up anything particularly tasteless, but he attributed that to memory loss, nostalgia, and generally not knowing any better. Aside from the meat, which he shot himself, he hadn't found anything very good to eat on the whole damn planet, the supposed cradle of humanity. Well, aside from sugar, which he always rationed because it gave him an odd high, almost like an eighth of Carweek bulb. An eighth? Almost like an eighth A Carweek? Eighth? Is it supposed to be eighth A Carweek, or should it be eighth of?
It's an eighth of a Carwick, but that's a typo.
Okay. So, of A?
Yeah.
Almost like an eighth of a Carweek bulb. Almost like an eighth of a Carweek bulb. Joe had finally gotten to the closet. With the rats when he heard a thump upstairs. Immediately, he felt a little surge of adrenaline, knowing he was finally going to have some answers from the moody little wretch. And that, he realized in alarm, was 100 times more important to him than getting back to his task of playing Joe the Kreenit Slayer across half of North America. North America, Joe had disgustedly found, didn't give a crap if he killed Kreenit or not. He could be standing over a dead Kreenit, gun in hand, arm out, smile on his face, and most of the survivors would spit on him as soon as He could be standing over a dead Kreenit, gun in hand, arm out, smile on his face, and most of the survivors would spit on him as soon as shake his hand. He could be standing over a dead Kreenit, gun in hand, arm out, smile on his face, and most of the survivors would spit on him as soon as shake his hand, blaming Kongies for their predicament, as if Kongies were somehow responsible for the genetic experiments that had gotten Earth its sacred turn of quiet time. It was like it always was. Each draft, humanity whined and complained and sent loving notes and care packages for the new recruits sent to boot camp, but it ultimately blamed the kids who got taken for everything humans hated about Congress. Like most of the sentient world, people refused to look inward, refused to acknowledge their own failings. Most Kongies, Joe had found, had ditched their black congressional uniforms to fit in. Less chance of being vendetta shot by a stranger that way. Thus, after eradicating 22 Kreenit only to have been spit on 11 times, attacked thrice, and offered a meal exactly once, Joe was a hell of a lot more interested in why this stranger spoke treat than he was in going back to his thankless monster hunt. He didn't want to appear desperate, though. A few minutes of disorientation would do her good. Knowing there was only one way for the girl to get out of the house unless she wanted a broken leg, and that was... and that one way happened to be the staircase behind him, Joe yanked open the pantry closet to finish his food search. The door opened on a wave of putrescence. As Joe gagged, his eyes located a tall, very skinny corpse curled up in one corner of the closet, bound hand and foot with zip ties. Rats had eaten away his face, flesh, and eyeballs. Sitting neatly on the floor in front of him was the corpulent... Sitting neatly on the floor in front of him was the corpulent, rotting, rat-chewed... Sitting neatly on the floor in front of him was the corpulent, rotting, rat-chewed head of a woman. Joe thought back to the pot of stew on the stove, then took out his canteen of JB and took a deep swig. Without examining the rest of the closet for food, he shut the door. Without examining the rest of the closet for food, he shut the door and backed out of the kitchen. If there was one thing he had learned upon dropping back on Earth, it was that humanity was barbaric, and over the last rotation of witnessing brutality, savagery, and cruelty, he had forgotten why he had wanted to save it in the first place. Joe was sitting on the base of the steps, staring at the bones jutting from the pot, reacquainting himself with Jim Beam, when the woman burst from the God damn it. One sec, guys.
Ha! That's funny, Carrie. You can read lips. I don't mind if you tell people. I just didn't want it to be part of the recording. That's all. So, but yeah, I hope you did see what I said, because holy shit, they fucked me over.
When the woman burst from the upstairs. When the woman. Joe was sitting on the base of the steps, staring at the bones jutting from the pot, reacquainting himself with Jim Beam, when the woman burst from the upstairs room. Joe was sitting on the base of the steps, staring at the bones jutting from the pot, reacquainting himself with Jim Beam, when the woman burst from the upstairs room, snarling in Whaloo Dreet.
Where am I?
She snapped.
Where is Dr. Phillip? I need to tell the worthless Ferg that his soft-laying services are no longer needed and that I'm ready to go back to Whaloo.
She wrinkled her nose.
And that I'm hungry. The skulker left me on this miserable planet.
Hey, you skipped several paragraphs there.
Oh, shit. Just one paragraph, looks like.
No, because she started with you. What are you doing
Did I
here?
say
You missed
you?
that one.
Where am I?
Oh, no, you're right. Okay.
The skulker left.
The skulker, where'd that go?
The skulker left me on his miserable planet without food.
Upstairs room, snarling in Whaloo Dreet.
You!
She snapped as soon as she saw him.
What are you doing here?
She glanced over his shoulder, then frowned when he realized she'd taken off the clothes he had Joe glanced over his shoulder, then frowned when he realized she'd taken off the clothes he had painstakingly acquired for her from a man who had apparently starved to death with his wife's head at his feet.
What the hell are you doing?
He demanded. The flask paused halfway to his lips.
Put your clothes back on.
No, different one. Let's try a different one.
What the hell are you doing?
There we go.
Where am I?
On.
Where am I? Skulker left me on his miserable planet without food.
Her breasts bounce when she's angry.
Joe noted. Joe noted, taking another swig of whiskey.
Who's Dr. Phillip?
Food! Without food!
Her breasts bounce when she's angry.
He asked, once the burn settled in his gut.
Actually, let me do that too.
Who's Dr. Phillip? Who's Dr. Phillip?
There we go. That's what it feels like.
Who's Dr. Phillip?
Let me get some more water.
He's my subordinate on the Shale Project, she growled.
Joe's attention sharpened when she sounded out the acronym in Kongi letters. Joe's attention sharpened when she sounded out the acronym. Joe's attention sharpened when she sounded out the Joe's attention sharpened when she sounded out the acronym in Kongi letters. Joe's attention sharpened when she sounded out the acronym in Kongi letters, her words sounding foreign and awkward.
Shale Project?
He asked, as casually as he could.
Shale Project?
She grunted.
I was to instruct the lazy, backward fighting base of this race on how to be good warriors, but they've obviously got no aptitude for it. I'm going home.
For a nerve-wracking moment, Joe thought perhaps she was a white, and that his universe-renowned white radar had failed him. Again.
And, where's home?
He asked, unobtrusively reaching for his gun. She raised her head and straightened her back as if she were a queen, putting her light pink areolas on excellent display.
Welu, home of the highest race of Dreet. It is time I return to my warriors and rally the clan. I intend to come back here and wipe this pathetic planet clean of soft-skinned scum like you.
For a long moment, Joe just stared at her over his canteen, wondering if she'd fried a few brain cells somewhere along the way. Then, because she looked utterly certain of what she was saying, and because she was speaking flawless, ancient Welu Dreet, Joe said,
You want to come back and kill off humanity. You want to come back and kill off humanity.
If that's what you call your miserable, softling existence, yes. By the time we're done, the fields will be full of staked corpses, and your children's children will tell stories of my wrath.
Joe took a last swig of whiskey, then capped it, contemplating her.
And just who do you think you are?
There is no think!
You are.
There is no think!
She spat at him. She raised her head in another regal pose.
I am Shale Gawelu, Prince of Welu.
She paused dramatically, obviously waiting for him to acknowledge that she was the ancient Welu. She paused dramatically, obviously waiting for him to acknowledge that she was the ancient Welu hero, apparently back from the dead and condensed into a body that was barely 5 digs if she stretched. If Joe hadn't been 1.5 rods from a woman that had been boiled and consumed by her own kind, he would have laughed at that. As it was, he just glanced down at his canteen and wondered what he was going to do when he ran out of whiskey.
I want to go to a spaceport,
Shale said, in a tone that demanded obedience.
I want to go to a spaceport,
Shale said.
I want you to put some clothes on,
Joe said. The idea that she planned to run around naked again after he'd used up almost half his nanite cream on her burns left him more than a little irritable. Shale narrowed her eyes and started down the steps toward him, and almost fell on her face. As Joe watched, curious, she grabbed the rail and held tight, her vibrant green eyes widening as she seemed to do a double-take.
What is this?
She whispered. Her entire body had gone utterly stiff, and she held the reel.
I think, what is this?
Okay.
What is this?
She whispered. Her entire body had gone utterly stiff, and she held the railing like she was afraid she was about to hurtle the rest of the way.
She's never seen stairs before,
Joe thought, more than a little stunned. It raised the hairs on the back of his neck a little, as well as gave him a wave of goosebumps across his arms. What kind of woman, especially a woman on Earth, hadn't seen stairs? Then he was jolted from his reverie by her desperate cry of,
Answer me, Skulker, or I will find your father's tech and bury it in Adash's ass!
Joe tucked his canteen into a pocket on his cargo belt, stood, and leaned casually against the wall, considering her. Standing there, clinging to the banister, cursing in dread, she seemed almost as alien in this place as Joe himself felt.
So, you're looking to go back to Welu?
Immediately,
she growled. She had started, very carefully, step by step, descending the stairs, her fists gripping the banister with white knuckles.
Just point me in the right direction and I'll get there myself. I don't need the company of a scaleless softling slowing me down.
Considering that she was probably only alive because Joe had deigned to save her, Joe said,
How about you put on some clothes and tell me why you think you're a dreet?
She paused, mid-step, and her head snapped up to give him a dangerous look.
Warriors do not wear the sheaths of cowards and weavers.
Which sounded a lot like what Davine would have said had Joe demanded he put on a 12XL shirt. Still, Joe didn't intend to let her leave the house without something on her back. Even then, his nanite tube was half empty, and he was pretty sure the ransacked local grocery stores weren't going to resupply him. As she reached the final step, he pointedly blocked her way off the stairs with his body.
You should put something on,
he said. The woman blinked up at him as if he had just picked his own brains out through his nose.
You dare stand in the path of Shale, Gawelu?
Joe unconcernedly itched his cheek, deciding that the tiny 5-dig woman needed a reality check.
Yeah, I do.
He crossed his big arms over his chest and peered down at her, perfectly willing to rough her up a little in order to get her over her dreet fetish. After all, his hand still hurt. Her pretty green eyes narrowed, and in one moment, Joe was casually standing at the base of the stairs, blocking her path.
Cadence was off on that one. It's in one moment, blah, and then blah.
Gotcha. And in one moment, Joe was casually standing at the base of the stairs, blocking her path, arms crossed, a smug look. And in one moment, Joe was casually standing at the base of the stairs, blocking her path, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. The next, something huge grabbed him and threw him with all the force of a Dasha's backhand, embedding Joe in the far wall, only a few feet from the stove and its grisly contents. Damn it. The next, something huge grabbed him and threw him with all the force of a Dasha's backhand, embedding Joe in the far wall, only a few feet from the stove and its grisly contents.
Burn!
Joe groaned, pulling himself out of the sheetrock. He ended up doing more falling than walking. And kind of collapsed into a ball on the floor.
Burn me! Burn me!
On the staircase, the woman unconcernedly finished her descent and walked past him as if he were a fly he'd... On the staircase, the woman unconcernedly finished her descent and walked past him as if he were a fly she had just swatted. And Joe, being at least as smart as the average bear, stayed down and watched her go, frantically trying to figure out what the hell she'd done to him. She hadn't moved. Her dreet fetish suddenly took on new meaning. It had felt like he'd been hit by a dreet. He had felt the massive fist clamp down on his torso and throw him with all the regard of an apple core. And considering that Dreet could shift the energy level of their scales and go completely invisible at will, did she have a sentinel? Joe had thought there were only two humans in the universe. Joe had thought there were only two humans in the universe who had earned themselves the dubious honor of having sentinels, himself and Rat. Not even Fred Mullock, that worthless human representative back at Kolionot, had attracted a sentinel. How could some nameless, bar-coded naked chick on Earth have a sentinel? That made no sense. Oblivious to his frantic mental scramble, the naked girl stepped through the huge, gaping hole in the wall and disappeared in the overgrown grass on the other side.
What?
Joe managed, prying himself painfully from the floor.
The soot?
He checked himself to see what had survived, found broken ribs and a knee that no longer worked correctly, then carefully got to his feet, clinging to the stove for support. Aching from head to toe, dizzy from what he was beginning to think was a concussion, crushed ribs making breathing difficult. Aching from head to toe, dizzy from what he was beginning to think was a concussion, crushed ribs making breathing difficult, Joe hobbled over to the base of the staircase, where his gun and his sack of gear still lay neatly against the wall. Abandoned. Again. Groaning, he slumped down beside it, pulled out his medkit, propped it on his knee, fumbled through it until he found a nano solution, and clumsily dosed himself. Then he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, waiting for the pain to go away. By the time Joe's head cleared, he'd thought of 20 different things he could say to the woman in reply, and most of them involved Jane. When he was mobile again, the woman, or whatever she was long gone. But Joe, the highly trained, planetary ops war hero that he was, could track her. And he was going to, too, if only to put a round through her brain for leaving him to die. Again.
All right.
Wow, you timed that perfectly.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so that was almost 70 minutes, that one. New set time. Yep.
If you're talking, we can't hear you. Oh.
All right. So let's see here. So what we just did, chapter 9 was 21, 28 pages. Yeah, so this next one's not going to fit in this cold read. However, I can get it started.
Did you say you were going to go at 10? Or, well, it's 10 my time. I don't know.
Oh, well, yeah. I actually should probably stop it here, guys. I do like lunch. I do like to have food. So anyway, I got a meeting I got to go to. But that is it for our cold read for today. That was part 5. We usually go to 30% on these, but that would have gone past the 5 days that we usually do for cold reads, and I want to actually do more per day than I usually do in
So
cold reads.
Devtron has a question for you there about
Jeff, could you please do SBT live 4 hours earlier sometimes for me in little Denmark in the EU? It is 2 a.m. when it starts, and I need my beauty sleep. Otherwise, I look like an ogre in the morning. Well, that would be 8 a.m. for me. If I'm starting 4 hours earlier than what I normally start for cold reads, and I'm not.
I think he's saying SBT Live, the what's coming this out.
Oh, yes, I see what you're saying. I don't know. It's the thing is, doing Sound Booth Theater live during the day would disrupt all of the workday, and Sound Booth Theater live is just kind of a thing we do at the end of the day that's like nice and fun and relaxing, something that we don't really have much of a agenda for, like we just do it as like, it's just fun. So maybe someday a special one might come around, but usually that's just the time that works out for everybody. And even then, a lot of the time no one else shows up besides me, Sin, and Ahmed, so that would be nice, but I don't think it's going to be very often that we do anything like that. But hey, just subscribe to the channel, watch the newsletter, and if we ever have an occasion to do it earlier in the day, you'll see it being advertised, because people won't be expecting it. But anyway, guys, that is it for my cold read for today. Thank you so much for coming to hang out. All the links for this series are in the description below. If you haven't started it already, everything that we've done for Sara King now is exclusively on the SBT app. So yeah, go check it all out. There's 3 full books of The Legend of Zero, and there's at least 4 short stories, might be 5 now. All available.
You're just talking Legend of Zero short stories?
Yeah.
I think it's 4.
4. Okay. So yeah, go check those out, guys. If you're interested, if you need stuff to hold you over until this one comes out. I will be starting live narration of this one in Discord tomorrow around 10 a.m., between 10 and 11, and I'm going to go as far as I can. I'm going to try and put in at least 4 hours a day for the rest of this book. And let's see, we're only 23%.
Oh yeah,
in.
they can find a really cool trailer for Zero Marked on your SBT Live.
That's
there.
true. Yeah, you can search our YouTube channel for that if you want to check it out. It's a fun little commercial. But anyway, thank you guys one more time for coming and hanging out. Really appreciate it. I won't be doing another cold read for a little while, because after I'm done with Zero's Return, I'm going to be focusing mainly on Monster Hunt NYC 3, listening to it and getting it ready to publish. And then I'm also going to be focusing on Dungeon Crawler Carl, the cinematic audio version, doing music, doing sound effects, doing directing, finishing up the script editing. We're really going all out with the process for the Dungeon Crawler Carl cinematic audio. And it's going to be legendary, but that just means it requires a lot of my time and attention. So, yeah, the next thing I'm going to be narrating will be the cinematic audio. So watch out for those, and I think I might even just do the whole thing on YouTube. And Dungeon Crawler Carl 6, I should be starting on when I get back from Alaska. I am going to hang out with Sara King, beginning of June. I believe it's June 1st that I'm dropping in, and
Yep,
we'll be
it'll be awesome.
We'll be hanging out in the woods and shooting guns and getting drunk.
Trying not to die.
And trying not to die. So, and shooting fish.
I don't think you're supposed to shoot fish.
Shooting fish with a desert eagle. So. Yeah, about mid-June. Mid-June is where I'm starting. So that's DCC 6. And that is the one where if you guys are able to gather 500 people, at least 500 people to watch the stream live at once, I will get a donut tattoo on my ass. I promise. And then I'll live stream that as well. So, if you guys want that to happen, be sure to get as many friends as you possibly can to come to the stream. Watch out for that. And yeah, I guess that's it. So again, you guys are awesome. Until next time, bye-bye.